The massive view screens throughout Nexus Station flickered to life, showing Marcus Chen's face alongside the words, "Human Terrorist," in glaring red letters. Marcus froze mid-step, watching as aliens of all species turned to stare at him with sudden fear and hatred in the crowded main concourse. His heart pounded against his ribs. Just seconds ago, he had been walking to the final peace treaty signing, datapad in hand with his carefully prepared speech. Now his world was shattering around him. "Citizen Marcus Chen of Earth, you are under arrest for sabotage and attempted genocide," announced a metallic voice as 4 armored Zarthan guards surrounded him, their scaled skin glistening under the station lights. Each guard stood nearly 7 feet tall, their bodies covered in overlapping plates that shimmered with an iridescent blue-green sheen. "There must be some mistake," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. "I've done nothing wrong." The lead guard, distinguished by red markings across his faceplates, stepped forward. "Silence, human. Your lies mean nothing now." Just yesterday, Marcus had been Earth's most respected diplomat. Today, he was being dragged away in energy cuffs, while the peace treaty he'd worked 3 years to build collapsed around him. The energy cuffs bit into his wrists, sending uncomfortable tingles up his arms. The crowds parted as the guards marched him through the station. Faces of dozens of species watched him pass, some with anger, others with satisfaction, a few with what might have been pity. Marcus recognized many of them from years of careful negotiations. "Please," he said to a Morgan delegate he'd shared meals with just days before. "You know me. This isn't right." The 6-limbed alien turned away, their feathered head crest flattening in what Marcus knew was a sign of rejection. They took him down levels he'd never seen before, deep into the security sector of Nexus Station. The hallways grew narrower, the lighting dimmer, until they reached a row of cells. With a rough shove, Marcus stumbled into one. A ripple of energy signaled the activation of the barrier field. In his holding cell, Marcus stared at the invisible barrier keeping him contained. Only a slight shimmer in the air, and an occasional spark when station dust hit it revealed its presence. The cell was small, barely 8 feet square, with nothing but a hard shelf for sleeping and a small privacy-screened corner with basic facilities. His thoughts went to his sister Lena back on Earth, to the struggling human colonies that needed this peace treaty to survive, and to the strange message he received just hours before his arrest. "They know what humans can become. That's why they fear you." The message had arrived unsigned, delivered directly to his private terminal. At the time, he dismissed it as the work of anti-alien extremists trying to undermine his work. Now, he wondered if it had been a warning. Marcus sank onto the hard shelf and tried to think clearly. The charges were absurd. Sabotage. Attempted genocide. He'd devoted his life to building bridges between species, not destroying them. The treaty had been so close. After 3 years of delicate negotiations, humans were finally going to gain access to the medical technologies that could end the plague ravaging the outer colonies. In exchange, Earth would share its unique terraforming techniques that had saved their own planet after the climate collapse. A sob caught in his throat as he thought of the children in the colonies. Without the Zarthan medical protocols, thousands more would die. Children like his niece, Maya, fighting for every breath as the plague slowly filled her lungs. "I'm sorry, Maya," he whispered to the empty cell. Hours passed with no food or water. The station's artificial day cycle dimmed to night, leaving Marcus in semi-darkness. Just as he was drifting into an uneasy sleep, a soft beep from the wall panel caught his attention. The small screen embedded in the wall lit up, displaying the stern face of Ambassador Krell, head of the Zarthan delegation. "Human," Krell said, his vertical pupils narrowing. "Your deception has been discovered. We found the sabotage device in the environmental systems. It would have released toxins fatal only to Zarthan biology during the signing ceremony." Marcus stood, approaching the screen. "Ambassador, I've worked with you for 3 years. You know I would never." Silence. Krell's neck frills extended in anger. We have your DNA on the device. We have station footage of you entering restricted areas. The evidence is conclusive. That's impossible, Marcus insisted. I've never been to the environmental sections. Someone is framing me. Krell's scaled face showed no emotion, but his voice dropped lower. The Grand Federation has tolerated humanity's presence because you seemed harmless, primitive. But some of us have seen your potential. Your species advances too quickly, too unpredictably. A chill ran down Marcus's spine as the words echoed the mysterious message he'd received. Your trial begins tomorrow, Krell continued. Though it is merely a formality, justice will be swift. The screen went dark, leaving Marcus alone with his racing thoughts. He paced the small cell, trying to make sense of it all. DNA evidence, footage, it was a setup, but who would go to such lengths? And why? Marcus pressed his palms against the cool wall, closing his eyes to think. The treaty would have benefited both species. The only ones who opposed it were extremists on both sides, those who thought cooperation was weakness. Unless the treaty itself wasn't the target. What if he was? Marcus sat back on the shelf, remembering that strange message once more. They know what humans can become. That's why they fear you. He looked at his hands, the hands that had spent thousands of hours drafting agreements, building consensus, finding common ground between species whose biology and psychology were fundamentally different. Maybe that was what frightened them. Not humanity's weapons or technology, but their adaptability, their empathy, their ability to understand the alien. Outside his cell, the station continued its night cycle, unaware that the delicate peace between species was unraveling. And somewhere, Marcus knew, whoever had framed him was watching, waiting to see if humanity would respond with the violence they expected, or with something more. Tomorrow, he would face their justice. But tonight, he would find his own answers. The human displays typical deception, hissed Judge Krell, his elongated head turning toward the other alien judges. Their species always claims innocence. The words echoed through the massive galactic tribunal chamber, bouncing off the polished stone walls and returning as whispers that surrounded Marcus from all sides. He stood completely alone in the center of the circular room, a single human figure on a raised platform illuminated by a harsh white light from above. Marcus took a slow, deep breath. The air smelled different here, sterile but with a faint trace of something like cinnamon, probably adjusted for the majority of the alien species present. His simple gray prisoner jumpsuit felt rough against his skin, a constant reminder of how quickly his life had changed. The room was designed to intimidate, with 50-foot ceilings and judges seated so high they looked like distant stars. 7 judges from 7 different species sat in a semicircle above him, their faces partially shadowed. Each judge sat on an elevated platform that could be adjusted for their species' particular biology. Judge Krell's seat was the highest of all. Marcus scanned the audience galleries that circled the chamber. Hundreds of aliens watched with interest, but not a single human face could be found. Earth had sent an attorney, his old friend Dr. Eliza Washington, but she had been denied entry to the station on a technicality about vaccination protocols that hadn't existed the day before. The evidence against the human is overwhelming, continued Judge Krell, his long fingers tapping a display screen Marcus couldn't see. DNA traces on the sabotage device, security footage showing the accused entering restricted areas, and communication logs indicating contact with known human extremist groups. The other judges nodded in what seemed like rehearsed agreement. Only the Exurethi judge, a massive being with translucent skin through which glowing organs could be seen pulsing, seemed to hesitate before joining the consensus. Marcus had been assigned a defense eye, a standard protocol for those without representation. But when he tried to discuss his case with it last night, the system had repeatedly glitched, cutting out mid-sentence or providing irrelevant legal precedents from centuries ago. I request access to the evidence against me, Marcus said firmly, his voice stronger than he felt. It's my right under Galactic Charter Section 47.3. Denied, replied all 7 judges in unison, their voices creating an eerie harmony that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Judge Krell's neck frills extended, displaying irritation. Charter exceptions apply in cases of terrorism. The evidence contains sensitive security information. Marcus clenched his jaw. How am I supposed to defend myself against evidence I can't see? You are not, said the Morgan judge, her feathered head crest rising. You are supposed to confess and spare us all the time and resources. A memory flashed through Marcus's mind. Growing up in the recovery zones after the climate wars, his mother telling him, "When the world is unfair, stand taller." She'd said it the day they'd been denied their water ration because of a clerical error, and again when his school closed due to lack of funding, and once more when she was dying from a disease that would have been easily curable with the very medical technology this treaty would have provided. He straightened his back and faced the judges with quiet dignity that made even some aliens in the audience shift uncomfortably. He noticed a few exchanging glances, whispering behind long fingers or tentacles. "I understand," Marcus said calmly, "that you've already decided my guilt. But I ask the court to consider one question. Why would I sabotage a treaty I spent 3 years building? A treaty that would save millions of human lives." "Humans are unpredictable," said the Trill judge, whose body resembled a tall, elegant insect. "Perhaps you had a change of heart. Perhaps you were always a double agent. Your motives are irrelevant to your guilt." For the next 4 hours, the prosecution presented its case. Holographic displays showed security footage of someone who looked like Marcus entering restricted areas, though the figure always kept their face turned away from cameras. They presented DNA evidence without explaining how it was collected or tested. 3 Zarthan security officers testified to finding the sabotage device, their stories so perfectly aligned that they seemed rehearsed. Not once was Marcus allowed to question a witness or challenge evidence. As the artificial day cycle began to dim, Judge Krell raised a hand. "We will continue tomorrow. The prosecution will finish presenting evidence, and the verdict will follow." "What about my defense?" Marcus asked. The judges exchanged looks that needed no translation across species barriers. Amusement. "You may make a statement before sentencing," said the Zarethi judge, the only one who seemed slightly uncomfortable with the proceedings. As is tradition, guards escorted Marcus back to his cell. He noticed they took a different route than yesterday. Through more populated areas of the station, he saw the fear and hatred in the eyes of passing aliens, already convinced of his guilt. News displays throughout the corridors showed his face alongside scenes of previous human conflicts, creating an unspoken connection. Back in his cell, Marcus sat on the hard shelf and buried his face in his hands. The trial was a farce, a performance to justify a decision already made. But why? What did they gain by framing him, by destroying the treaty? He was still pondering this when the lights dimmed for night cycle. As the corridor outside fell silent, he heard a faint buzz, different from the usual hum of the station. The force field across his cell entrance flickered briefly, just for a second. Then he saw it, a small data chip sliding across the floor as if pushed by an invisible hand. Marcus quickly picked it up and concealed it in his palm, just as a guard walked by on patrol. When he was alone again, Marcus examined the chip. It was standard galactic tech, compatible with most systems. But without a reader, it was useless to him. Then he noticed the small blinking light on his malfunctioning defense AI terminal. He inserted the chip with trembling fingers. A single message appeared, text only, no sender identified. "You are not alone. The trial is rigged, but we have found allies. Evidence is being gathered. Help is coming. Stay strong, diplomat." They fear what humans represent, the power to unite what they wish to keep divided. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the first spark of hope since his arrest. Someone out there believed in him. Someone was fighting for him. He would stand tall tomorrow. For Earth, for the colonies, for the future this treaty promised, and for whoever had risked everything to get him this message. "Your brother is innocent, but we have only 48 hours to prove it," said the tall Iridani to Lena Chen. His name was Zorn, once Marcus's teacher and now his only hope. Lena stared up at the alien standing in her small apartment, trying to process his unexpected arrival. Zorn towered over her at nearly 7 feet tall, his slender body draped in flowing silver robes that seemed to catch light from angles that didn't exist. His skin was pale blue, almost luminescent in the dim light, and his four-fingered hands moved with careful precision as he placed a secure communication device on her table. "How did you get past Earth security?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "All alien visitors are being screened since Marcus's arrest." Mrs. Harrington, Victoria Harrington, as she loudly introduced herself, dropped any pretense of subtlety. "Well, I'm sure he'd be more comfortable elsewhere. This simply isn't what I paid for." Marcus felt something shift inside him, a dam cracking after holding back too many waters. "What exactly did you pay for, Mom?" he asked quietly. The cabin seemed to freeze. Mrs. Harrington blinked, apparently shocked that he'd spoken. "I paid for a premium experience," she said, chin lifted. "A certain caliber of travel." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And my presence diminishes that caliber." "I didn't say that," she replied, though her expression said everything her words didn't. The elderly gentleman beside Marcus cleared his throat. "Young man, don't let her bother you. Some people are simply—" "No, please," Marcus interrupted gently. "I'd like Mrs. Harrington to clarify what about my presence disturbs her premium experience." The air in the cabin grew thick with tension. Other passengers stopped pretending not to listen. Several pulled out phones, sensing something significant was unfolding. The soft click of seat belts unbuckling punctuated the silence as people turned to watch. Victoria Harrington stood frozen, her mouth slightly open. She clearly hadn't expected Marcus to address her directly. Most times, people like Marcus stayed quiet. They absorbed the small cuts, the pointed remarks, the sideways glances. They understood the rules of the game. Make no waves. Be twice as good. Stay invisible when convenient for others. That was the unspoken contract. But contracts could be broken. "I never mentioned your—" Victoria paused, searching for a word that wouldn't incriminate her further. "Your characteristics." "My characteristics," Marcus repeated, his voice still calm but carrying a new edge. The years of careful restraint were slipping away like sand through his fingers. "Please, be specific, Mrs. Harrington. Which of my characteristics is affecting your premium experience?" Jessica and Michael exchanged worried glances. This was quickly becoming the kind of situation that ended up in news headlines and social media storms. "Sir," Michael began cautiously, "perhaps we should." "No," Marcus said firmly, raising his hand slightly. "I'd genuinely like to hear Mrs. Harrington explain herself." He turned his gaze back to Victoria, who was now clutching her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Frank, the elderly gentleman beside Marcus, was watching with open interest now. His earlier discomfort had been replaced by something that looked almost like satisfaction. "You're twisting my words," Victoria said, her voice rising. "This is exactly what people like you do. Play the victim when someone simply asks for the service they paid for." "People like me." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And what people would those be, exactly?" The trap was set, and Victoria had walked right into it. The entire first-class cabin held its breath. A young woman 3 rows back whispered something to her companion. The businessman who had been pretending to read his magazine finally gave up the charade and washed openly. Victoria's face flushed deeper. "I simply meant people who immediately assume everything is about race when it's clearly about customer service standards." "But I haven't mentioned race at all, Mrs. Harrington," Marcus pointed out, his voice steady. "You're the first to bring it up." Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish suddenly finding itself on dry land. She turned to Michael, appealing for support. Are you going to let him speak to me this way? I'm being harassed. Michael's professional mask slipped just slightly. Ma'am, from what I've observed, you approached this passenger's seat and demanded he be moved based on criteria you've yet to clearly articulate. If anyone could claim harassment here, it wouldn't be you. A small murmur of approval rippled through the cabin. Someone in the back actually clapped once before going silent again. Marcus felt a strange lightness spreading through his chest. For decades, he carefully measured every word, calculated every reaction. The mental math was exhausting. Is this battle worth fighting? Will this cost me a client? Will this affect my children's future? Today, the equations no longer seemed to matter. Mrs. Harrington, Marcus said, leaning forward slightly. I'm a frequent flyer with over 2 million miles on this airline. I've closed deals worth more money than most people see in a lifetime. My firm employs over 300 people. I have 2 degrees from Harvard. I sit on the boards of 3 major companies. He paused, letting the information sink in. I'm curious which part of that resume makes me unsuitable to sit next to you in first class. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient noise of the plane seemed to dim. Victoria's face went through a remarkable series of transformations, from righteous anger to confusion to the dawning realization that she had severely miscalculated. This wasn't some random black man she could bully. This was someone with power, someone who might actually make her face consequences. I never said you were unsuitable, she finally managed, her voice now uncertain. You're putting words in my mouth. Then please clarify what you meant when you suggested I should be moved to economy to accommodate your comfort, Marcus pressed. The years of letting things slide, of smiling through insults, of explaining away slights to his children had crystallized into this perfect moment of clarity. Frank shifted in his seat. I believe we all understood exactly what you meant, Mrs. Harrington. Victoria's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for allies and finding none. The unified front of white politeness that usually protected people like her was nowhere to be found. Instead, she saw open disapproval on the faces around her. This is ridiculous, she snapped, her voice rising again as panic set in. I'm being attacked for making a simple request. There was nothing simple about your request, Marcus replied. You asked the airline to move me, specifically, because my presence made you uncomfortable. I'm simply asking you to explain why. The young woman who had been recording lifted her phone higher, no longer pretending to be doing anything else. Victoria noticed the phone, and her eyes widened. Are you recording this? That's an invasion of my privacy. I'll sue. We're in a public space, Mom, the young woman replied calmly. There's no expectation of privacy here. Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The pure, uncomplicated satisfaction of watching someone who had never faced consequences suddenly realize they might be held accountable. It wasn't vindictiveness. It was simply justice, long delayed. I want to speak to the captain immediately, Victoria demanded, turning back to Michael. This situation is out of control. I believe that's an excellent idea, Michael agreed, surprising her. The captain should definitely be informed about what's happening. As Michael stepped away to use the cabin phone, Marcus caught Frank's eye. The older man gave him a small, approving nod. Well done, Frank said quietly. Marcus shook his head slightly. I'm not sure anything's been done yet. But he was wrong. Something had definitely been done. A line had been crossed, not by Victoria Harrington, but by Marcus himself. After decades of carefully stepping around the invisible boundaries others had set for him, he had finally refused to play by rules he never agreed to in the first place, and it felt like flying before the plane had even left the ground. By now, the confrontation had drawn the attention of everyone in first class. Jessica had been joined by the lead flight attendant, Michael, a veteran with 20 years of service, who sized up the situation immediately. Is there a problem here? Michael asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. Before Mrs. Harrington could respond, A young woman across the aisle lowered her phone. She'd been recording. Yes, there's a problem. This woman is demanding this gentleman be removed because of his race. I never said anything about race. Mrs. Harrington snapped. You didn't have to, replied an Asian American woman 2 rows ahead who had turned around. We all understand exactly what's happening. Mrs. Harrington's face flushed. This is ridiculous. I'm being attacked for requesting basic customer service. Marcus felt strangely detached now, watching the scene unfold as if from a distance. Throughout his life, from the elite boarding school where he'd been the only black student in his year, through Harvard, through the executive ranks, he'd been told his success depended on restraint, on not making others uncomfortable with his anger, no matter how justified. Today, watching strangers defend him, something broke and healed simultaneously within him. The Asian American woman unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. She was dressed in a crisp navy suit, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. A small gold pin on her lapel marked her as a member of the State Bar Association. My name is Dr. Grace Chin, she announced clearly. I'm a professor of civil rights law at Boston University. What we are witnessing is a textbook example of discriminatory behavior in a public accommodation setting. Mrs. Harrington's mouth dropped open. How dare you? You don't know anything about me. I know what I'm seeing, Dr. Chen replied calmly, and what everyone else here is seeing. The young woman with the phone stood up too. She couldn't have been more than 25, with bright blue hair and several small ear piercings. I've been recording since you first came down the aisle, ma'am. You've made it pretty clear what your issue is, even if you're trying to use code words. Code words. Mrs. Harrington sputtered. What are you talking about? Premium experience. Certain caliber. More comfortable elsewhere, the young woman quoted. We all know what those mean when you're pointing them at the only black passenger in first class. More passengers were turning around now. A middle-aged white man in a business suit spoke up from the second row. I've been flying first class for 15 years, and I've never heard anyone demand another passenger be moved like this. Mrs. Harrington looked around wildly, clearly shocked that no one was taking her side. This is a mob mentality. You're all ganging up on me because of some perceived slight. Marcus watched it all with a strange sense of wonder. In his 45 years, he had endured countless moments like this. The whispered comments, the assumptions, the small cuts that were always followed by gaslighting when named. But never had he seen so many strangers step forward, unprompted, to name the truth. Frank patted Marcus's arm gently. The world is changing, son. Slowly, but it's changing. Jessica, the flight attendant, stepped closer to Mrs. Harrington. Ma'am, I need you to take your assigned seat now, or we'll have to ask you to deplane. Deplane? Me? Mrs. Harrington's voice reached a new pitch. I'm a victim here. That man, she pointed at Marcus, has turned everyone against me. That man hasn't said more than a few sentences, Michael noted dryly. You've done all the talking. The businessman in the second row chuckled, which only inflamed Mrs. Harrington further. I want to speak to the captain right now, she demanded, stomping her foot like a child. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair was coming loose around her face, and 2 angry red spots had appeared on her cheeks. The captain has been informed of the situation, Michael replied evenly. He's authorized me to give you one final chance to take your seat quietly, or airport security will escort you from the aircraft. Mrs. Harrington looked around again, her eyes wide with disbelief. Are you all seeing this? I'm being threatened now. I'm going to sue this airline. I'm going to sue all of you. She jabbed her finger toward the young woman with the phone. Especially you, with your illegal recording. Again, public space. The young woman replied, unruffled. But please, keep going. This is getting lots of views already. Marcus found himself smiling slightly, not from malice, but from the sheer unexpectedness of it all. For most of his life, he'd been told explicitly and implicitly that his success depended on silent accommodation, on making white people comfortable, on never showing anger, on being professional, which often meant being invisible. Yet here he sat, having broken that cardinal rule by simply asking Mrs. Harrington to explain herself, and the sky hadn't fallen. In fact, something much more surprising had happened. People had noticed, and they had spoken up. An older woman with silver hair, sitting at the front of the cabin, turned in her seat. "Young lady," she addressed Mrs. Harrington, who was at least 50. "I'm old enough to remember when people like you didn't even try to hide their prejudice. At least back then you were honest about it." Mrs. Harrington gasped. "People like me? What is that supposed to mean?" "Racists, dear," the older woman said simply. "I'm talking about racists." The cabin fell silent. The word hung in the air, the word so many people danced around, the accusation everyone feared, the truth that lurked beneath the surface of so many civilized interactions. Mrs. Harrington's face went from red to white. "How dare you call me that? I have black friends. My children's piano teacher is black." Marcus had to suppress a laugh. The black friend defense was so predictable, it was almost comical. Dr. Chen spoke up again. "Having black acquaintances doesn't prevent someone from exhibiting racist behavior. Mrs. Harrington, your actions here today speak for themselves." "This is insane," Mrs. Harrington whispered, suddenly seeming smaller. "All I wanted was a comfortable flight." "So did Mr. Bennett," Frank said quietly from beside Marcus. "So did all of us." Marcus realized with a start that Frank knew his full name, despite Marcus having only introduced himself as Marcus earlier. Had Frank recognized him? It wasn't impossible. Marcus had been featured in several business magazines over the years. A gentle hand touched his shoulder. He looked up to see a flight attendant he hadn't noticed before. An older black woman whose name tag read Diana. "Mr. Bennett," she said softly, "would you like a fresh drink?" On the house, of course. The simple gesture of kindness, of seeing him, of acknowledging what was happening without making a spectacle of it, brought a lump to Marcus's throat. He nodded. "Thank you. Just water would be fine." Diana gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze before moving away. It was the kind of touch that conveyed volumes without words. "I see you. I understand. You're not alone." Mrs. Harrington had fallen into a stunned silence, her earlier bravado evaporating as she realized she had no allies in this cabin. The narrative she had expected, where her comfort would be prioritized, where her thinly veiled demands would be accommodated, had collapsed around her. Marcus felt the strange detachment giving way to something else. Not anger, not even satisfaction, but a profound sense of witnessing something important. For the first time in his life, he hadn't had to fight this battle alone. He hadn't had to be both the victim and the educator, both the target and the one explaining why the target mattered. Today, others had stepped into that gap. Today, strangers had seen him as human first, and that, perhaps, was worth more than all the first-class tickets in the world. The commotion had reached the cockpit. Captain David Reynolds emerged, his presence immediately commanding attention. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, though the tight line of his mouth suggested he'd already been briefed. Mrs. Harrington saw an opportunity. "Captain, I've been a Platinum member for 15 years, and I'm being harassed simply for requesting appropriate seating." The elderly gentleman beside Marcus spoke up. "That's a lie. She demanded this gentleman be removed because she doesn't want to sit near him. Is this true?" Captain Reynolds asked, looking directly at Mrs. Harrington. "I simply asked if other arrangements could be made," she said defensively. "I paid for." "Let me be clear," the captain interrupted. "Every passenger who purchased a ticket is entitled to their assigned seat. We do not remove passengers based on another passenger's comfort with their race, gender, religion, or any other characteristic." He paused, letting his words settle across the cabin. "Now we have two options. Everyone can take their assigned seats so we can depart, or anyone uncomfortable with our policies can choose to take a different flight." Captain Reynolds stood tall in his crisp uniform, his silver-streaked hair and weathered face reflecting 25 years of flying commercial aircraft. His presence brought an immediate hush to the cabin. Even Mrs. Harrington seemed momentarily subdued by his authority. The captain's eyes scanned the first-class cabin slowly, taking in the scene. He noticed the young woman with the phone still recording, Dr. Chen standing with arms crossed, and Marcus sitting quietly with Frank beside him. His gaze finally settled back on Mrs. Harrington, who was fidgeting with her pearl necklace. "Mrs. Harrington," the captain continued, his voice measured but firm, "I've been informed of the situation by my crew members. They are trained professionals whose reports I trust completely." Mrs. Harrington straightened her spine, sensing her last chance to salvage the situation. "Captain Reynolds, I'm sure they've misunderstood. I merely requested the comfort I paid for as a longtime Platinum member. I spend over $50,000 annually with this airline." The captain nodded thoughtfully. "We appreciate your business, Mrs. Harrington. We appreciate all our passengers' business, including Mr. Bennett's." He gestured toward Marcus. A flicker of surprise crossed Mrs. Harrington's face. "You know him?" "I know his name is on the passenger manifest, just like yours," Captain Reynolds replied coolly. "And I know that he, like every other passenger, deserves to be treated with respect and dignity while on my aircraft." Frank shifted in his seat, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Marcus remained still, watching the scene unfold with the same calm detachment he'd maintained throughout the confrontation. "This is outrageous," Mrs. Harrington said, her voice rising again. "I'm being treated like a criminal for making a simple request." The young woman with the blue hair and phone spoke up. "A request for someone to be removed because of their race isn't simple. It's discrimination." "I never mentioned race," Mrs. Harrington snapped for what seemed like the 100th time. Captain Reynolds raised his hand slightly, silencing the brewing argument. "Mrs. Harrington, let me explain something clearly. This aircraft is under my command. Federal aviation regulations give me full authority over who stays and who goes. My decision is final and non-negotiable." The cabin grew even quieter. The air felt charged with tension. "Our airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior," Captain Reynolds continued. "Based on the reports from my crew and the statements of multiple witnesses, I have reason to believe your request was not made in good faith." Mrs. Harrington's face paled. For the first time, she seemed to realize that her status as a Platinum member might not shield her from consequences. "Captain, you can't possibly believe," she began. "Mrs. Harrington," he interrupted firmly, "you have a choice to make. You can take your assigned seat without further disruption, or you can deplane and book another flight. Which will it be?" The entire cabin held its breath. Marcus glanced at Frank, who gave him a small nod of reassurance. This wasn't Marcus's first encounter with discrimination, but it was perhaps the first time he'd seen it addressed so directly by someone in authority. Mrs. Harrington looked around the cabin desperately, seeking any ally. Finding none, she turned back to the captain with a forced smile. "There's clearly been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice suddenly honeyed. "Of course I'll take my seat. I never intended to cause any trouble." A collective sigh seemed to pass through the first-class cabin. Passengers who had been watching the drama unfold began to settle back in their seats, some exchanging knowing glances. Captain Reynolds nodded once, his face impassive. "I'm glad to hear it. We'll be departing shortly." As he turned to head back to the cockpit, Mrs. Harrington stepped into the aisle, blocking his path. Her earlier submissive demeanor vanished instantly. "Actually," she said loudly, "I want this incident reported. I've been publicly humiliated and accused of horrible things. I want all their names." She gestured wildly around the cabin. "Especially his." She pointed directly at Marcus. The captain's expression hardened. "Mrs. Harrington, step back into your row, please. Not until you acknowledge how I've been treated," she insisted, her voice shrill. "Do you know who my husband is? He plays golf with your CEO." Marcus watched as something shifted in Captain Reynolds' face, a subtle hardening, a decision being made. Mrs. Harrington, this is your final warning. Take your seat now, or you will be removed from this aircraft. The ultimatum hung in the air. Even Mrs. Harrington seemed to sense that she had crossed a line. For a moment, it looked like she might comply. Then her eyes landed on Marcus again, and something in her expression twisted with renewed anger. "This is his fault," she hissed. "He's manipulated all of you." Captain Reynolds sighed deeply. "Michael," he addressed the lead flight attendant, "please call airport security." "Wait," Mrs. Harrington cried, suddenly panicked. "You can't do this. I'm a Platinum member." "You're a passenger who is refusing to comply with crew instructions," Captain Reynolds corrected. "That's a federal violation." Michael moved to the cabin phone while Jessica stepped forward to block Mrs. Harrington from following the captain, who had turned back toward the cockpit. "This isn't over," Mrs. Harrington called after him. "My husband will have your job." Captain Reynolds paused at the cockpit door and looked back at her. "Mrs. Harrington, I've been flying for 25 years. I've handled emergency landings, medical evacuations, and terrorist threats. Your husband doesn't frighten me." With that, he disappeared into the cockpit, leaving Mrs. Harrington standing speechless in the aisle. Frank leaned toward Marcus. "That," he whispered, "was something to see." Marcus nodded slightly. He felt no joy in Mrs. Harrington's humiliation, but there was something profoundly moving about witnessing justice administered so clearly and directly. All his life, he had been told to accommodate, to understand, to be the bigger person. He had taught his children to do the same, to navigate a world that wasn't always fair with grace and dignity. But perhaps they deserved more than just survival strategies. Perhaps they deserved a world where right and wrong were called by their proper names, where someone like Captain Reynolds would stand up and say, "This stops here." As airport security was being summoned, the reality of what was happening finally seemed to dawn on Mrs. Harrington. Her face crumpled slightly, the anger giving way to genuine fear. "Please," she said to Jessica, her voice suddenly small. "I'll be quiet. I'll take my seat. Don't do this." But the wheels of consequence were already in motion, and not even a Platinum membership could stop them now. Mrs. Harrington's indignation escalated to fury. "Do you know who my husband is? He plays golf with your CEO." "Ma'am, please lower your voice," Michael requested. "I will not be silenced. This is reverse discrimination," she shouted, pointing at Marcus. "He's playing the race card, and you're all falling for it. I never even mentioned race." Marcus finally stood. At 6'2", his presence commanded attention. When he spoke, his voice was measured, controlled, the voice that had closed multi-million-dollar deals and mentored dozens of young professionals. "Mrs. Harrington, I haven't said a word about race. You're the only one who keeps bringing it up." The cabin fell silent. Even Mrs. Harrington seemed momentarily at a loss. Captain Reynolds nodded to Michael. "Please call airport security." "This is outrageous," Mrs. Harrington sputtered. "I'm a paying customer." "So is everyone else," the captain replied firmly. 10 minutes later, 2 security officers boarded. When Mrs. Harrington refused to leave voluntarily, they escorted her off the plane, her protests echoing down the aisle until she disappeared from view. The security officers, a tall man named Officer Wilson and a shorter woman named Officer Rodriguez, approached with practiced calm. Their uniforms were neat and professional, their expressions neutral but firm. They had clearly handled situations like this before. "Ma'am," Officer Wilson addressed Mrs. Harrington, "we've been informed that you're refusing to comply with crew instructions. We need you to gather your belongings and come with us." Mrs. Harrington stared at them in disbelief. Her perfectly manicured hand clutched her pearls as if they might protect her from what was happening. "This is a mistake," she insisted. "I'm Victoria Harrington. My husband is Richard Harrington of Harrington Financial Group. Your identity isn't the issue, Mom," Officer Rodriguez said calmly. "This is about your behavior on this aircraft." Mrs. Harrington looked around wildly, as if expecting someone to jump to her defense at the last moment. Her eyes landed on Marcus, who had sat back down but was watching the scene unfold with quiet dignity. "This is your fault," she hissed at him. "You've turned everyone against me." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. Frank patted his arm gently. "Stay strong, son," he murmured. "You've done nothing wrong here." Dr. Chen, who had remained standing at her seat, spoke up again. "Officers, several of us witnessed Mrs. Harrington's behavior and would be willing to provide statements if needed." The young woman with blue hair held up her phone. "I've recorded most of it." Officer Wilson nodded. "Thank you. We may need those statements." Mrs. Harrington's face contorted with fresh outrage. "You're taking their side, without even hearing my version." "Ma'am, we're not taking sides," Officer Rodriguez explained patiently. "The captain has made a decision based on your refusal to follow crew instructions. That decision is final." "I want to call my lawyer," Mrs. Harrington demanded. "You're welcome to do that once we're off the aircraft," Officer Wilson replied. "Right now, we need you to come with us so this flight can depart." Mrs. Harrington crossed her arms over her chest like a stubborn child. "I paid for this seat, and I'm not leaving it." Officer Rodriguez sighed. "Ma'am, you can either walk off this plane with dignity, or we can assist you off. Those are your only options at this point." Something in her tone, perhaps the hint that assist might be more physical than verbal, finally seemed to reach Mrs. Harrington. She glanced at both officers, then at the watching passengers, and appeared to calculate her remaining options. "Fine," she said icily. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." She reached for her designer handbag and snatched it from the overhead bin. As she did so, she knocked over a small carry-on belonging to another passenger. She didn't stop to pick it up or apologize. Officer Wilson retrieved her larger suitcase from the overhead compartment, while Officer Rodriguez stood by to escort her off the plane. Mrs. Harrington moved slowly, deliberately, making a show of checking her seat to ensure she hadn't left anything behind.